Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce called her when he thought she couldn't hear. Not unkind, exactly. Dismissive in the way that certain people dismiss things they believe they understand completely and therefore don't need to examine further. Elena Martinez had heard the phrase before, in Tikrit, in the field hospital, in the transport helicopters where doctors shouted orders and nurses executed them without question. She'd heard it in her own head for 3 years, ever since she'd walked away from everything and put on scrubs at St. Michael's Hospital in Raleigh. But he had no idea who was standing in the ICU at 2:24 a.m., hand steady as a surgical laser, checking the oxygen saturation on Sergeant Major James Dawson's 8-year-old son, Marcus. He had no idea what those hands had done. The hospital hummed around her, fluorescent lights buzzing like insects trapped in plastic, the ventilator's mechanical wheeze, the distant beep of monitors. Elena moved between the beds with the terrible efficiency of someone who'd learned her craft under fire. Her footsteps made no sound. Her movements took up minimal space. She was the kind of invisible that came from practice, from years of knowing that the smaller you were, the less attention you drew, the more work you could actually do. Marcus Dawson lay in bed 3, his small frame diminished further by the layers of blankets, his breathing slightly irregular at the edges. His chart sat in the rack at the foot of the bed. Elena had read it twice. Once during shift change at 11 and again at 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep and the irregularity in his oxygen saturation pattern had bothered her the way a loose thread bothers someone with military training. The kind of small detail that multiplies into catastrophe if you ignore it. She adjusted his 4-line, a 24-gauge, pediatric placement, the kind that required precision, and noted the time. 2:48, she checked his vitals again. O2 sat 93%. Should be 96, 97 at minimum for a child with his history. She made a note in the chart. Not a report, not yet. Just a note. A question mark that only another trained eye would recognize. The Dawson boy had been admitted 4 days ago with complications from spina bifida, a spinal cord malformation that would follow him through life like a shadow, limiting what his body could do but not what his father refused to let him become. The sergeant major had brought him in personally, had sat with him through the first night until a resident finally told him visiting hours had ended. Elena had seen it in the father's face, that particular exhaustion that comes from fighting on 2 battlefields at once, one internal, one in the hospital corridors where people in white coats decided what was possible and what wasn't. She'd touched the folded flag in her locker before this shift, the way she touched it before every shift. The flag was small, carefully pressed, issued at a ceremony she could barely remember. It was from her teammate in Tikrit, Staff Sergeant Maria Reyes, who'd run into a collapsed building to pull out a civilian child and hadn't come back out. Elena kept the flag in a shadow box. She touched it every night. Not a ritual, exactly. A reminder. The ICU contained 6 beds. 3 occupied. Elena moved through them with the kind of fluid precision that made even routine work look surgical. She checked the central line on Mrs. Chen in bed 1, placement still good, dressing dry, no signs of infection. She adjusted the Foley catheter drainage on Mr. Rodriguez in bed 4, noting the color and specific gravity of his urine. The details that meant everything. Details that doctors glossed over because there were so many of them, and a resident could only hold so much in their mind at once. At 3 in the morning, the hospital belonged to nurses. Doctors were ghosts. The ER was a roaring thing somewhere below, but up here on the 4th floor, in the ICU, the night shift ran on institutional muscle memory and the specific knowledge that only accumulated through time and attention. Elena had both. She had too much of both. Couldn't sleep. The voice came from behind her. Elena turned. It was Michael Cortez, one of the residents, younger than her by maybe 6 years, with the exhausted eyes of someone on hour 18 of a 24-hour shift. He was holding a tablet and a cup of coffee that looked like it had been made sometime in the previous century. Elena didn't answer the question directly. She never did. Marcus Dawson's O2 sat dropped to 93 at 2:43. Pattern is irregular. Worth checking the BiPAP settings. Cortez glanced at the chart. He was a decent resident, conscientious, not arrogant, the kind who actually listened when nurses talked to him instead of treating them like the help. He nodded. "I'll check him." "Good catch." That was the way it was supposed to work. Information up, decision-making down. Elena had made her observation. Cortez would verify it. The sergeant major's son would be fine. That was the story of the ICU at night: small interventions, incremental improvements, the steady work of keeping people alive when their bodies decided to fail them. But it wasn't always that simple. Dr. Pierce arrived for morning rounds at 7 o'clock sharp, which was early enough to make the statement that he was the kind of doctor who didn't take things at a slower pace than necessary. He wore his white coat over a navy suit that probably cost more than Elena's rent. His shoes were polished to a shine that suggested someone else did the polishing. He carried himself through the hospital as if he owned it, not arrogantly, exactly, but with the certainty of someone who had never in his life wondered if he belonged in a room. He was handsome in the way that wealthy men often were, with features arranged in an order that the world rewarded. He had grey at his temples that he probably paid his barber to highlight. He had the kind of smile that people believed because people had been believing it for 30-some years. He noticed Elena only because she was there. Not because she was visible. He asked Cortez about the Dawson boys' overnight vitals, about his current medications, about the plan for the day. He didn't ask Elena anything. His eyes moved past her the way light passes through a window, present but not seeing. The O2 sat dipped in the night, Cortez said, consulting his tablet. We adjusted the BiPAP. Respiratory had a look. It's stable now. Pierce nodded, already moving to the next bed. Elena stood at the medication cart, drawing up the morning doses of antibiotics. Her hands knew the work. Her mind was elsewhere, noting the way Pierce's attention moved through the room like a searchlight, touching everything, illuminating nothing that required genuine examination. At 9 o'clock, she pulled her lunch and sat in the break room with a container of rice and vegetables that she'd prepared the night before. The break room was small, with a refrigerator that had never been completely clean and a microwave that smelled like someone had exploded fish in it approximately 3 weeks ago. Elena ate at the table by the window, watching the parking lot below. Cars moved in and out. People hurried. The world continued its business, indifferent to hospitals, indifferent to small dramas of diagnosis and treatment. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. Captain, this is SGT Major Dawson. Want to talk about what you saw with my boy? When you get a break. She stared at it. Not if you get a break. When? The certainty of someone accustomed to giving orders. She didn't respond immediately. She finished her lunch. She disposed of the container. She washed her hands. She walked back to the ICU. The morning was already warming. North Carolina in late May had a specific humidity that clung to skin like a second layer. The hospital air conditioning was fighting a losing battle. That afternoon, the billing department sent around a notice about a procedure code that had been submitted to insurance. It was routine, the kind of document that most people glanced at and filed away. Elena read it carefully. The code was for a complex diagnostic workup, billed at $3,200, attributed to one of Dr. Pierce's patients from 2 weeks ago. A woman with lower back pain who'd come to the ER on a Friday afternoon. Elena had been working that shift. She'd been present in the room. The workup had never happened. The woman had come in, Pierce had ordered an X-ray, she'd gotten the X-ray, and Pierce had prescribed pain medication and told her to follow up with her primary care physician. That was it. 20 minutes, total. Nothing complex. Certainly nothing diagnostic enough to justify a $3,200 code. Elena went to the nurse supervisor's office at 3:15. Her shift didn't end until 7, but this couldn't wait. The supervisor was Karen Munez, a woman in her 50s who'd worked at St. Michael's for 21 years and had the kind of institutional knowledge that made her valuable and wary in equal measure. Karen, I need to ask about a procedure code from 2 weeks ago, Elena said. Karen looked up from her computer. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eye shifted. Which one? Elena placed the notice on the desk. The code, the patient, the date. Karen read it slowly. Then she looked at Elena with something that might have been concern or might have been caution. That's from Dr. Pierce's case. The patient never had a diagnostic workup. She had an X-ray and a prescription. Karen picked up the notice and studied it. I'll check into it, she said, in a tone that suggested she would check into it by doing nothing, or by checking into it in the quietest possible way. It should be correct, Elena said. The code. For what was actually done? Karen nodded. I'll look at it. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. Which meant, thank you for telling me something that will now become my problem. Elena left the office. She didn't know it then, but she'd just crossed a line that she wouldn't be allowed to uncross. That evening, after her shift, Elena went to her locker and touched the folded flag in its shadow box. The fabric was faded now, the crease permanent from years of pressing. Her name was embroidered on the back in a script too small to read without looking for it, Captain Elena Martinez. The person who owned that name had done things in Tikrit that changed her. The person who worked as a nurse at St. Michael's Hospital had tried to put that person away, had wrapped her in scrubs and invisibility, had believed that staying quiet was the same as healing. But staying quiet was just staying quiet. The wounds were still there. In her left hand, which tremored when she was still. In her sleep, which came in fragments interrupted by dreams of collapsed buildings and people calling out names in languages that only the dead remembered. In the flag itself, which represented everything she'd lost and everyone who'd trusted her. She touched it with her right hand, the steady one, the one that had held it together. What happened next would change everything. The conference room at St. Michael's Hospital in Raleigh was packed. All 47 chairs filled. Standing room crowded with residents, attending physicians, nursing supervisors pressed against the walls. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song. Dr. Pierce stood at the podium with a patient chart held high, the pages catching the light like a prosecutor's evidence. This, he announced, is a textbook example of outdated triage protocols. He turned the pages slowly, deliberately, letting everyone see. The room was silent. Elena stood at the back wall, hands clasped in front of her, wearing the kind of stillness that comes from counting your heartbeats. The nurse, Pierce continued, not using her name, placed a needle here. He tapped the diagram with a pen. The tip made a small clicking sound against the laminated paper. Completely unorthodox. Completely outside standard procedure. If the patient had died, we'd be looking at a lawsuit. Potentially a wrongful death claim. He looked up over his reading glasses. But we can't expect everyone to understand modern medicine, can we? Some people learn from different educational systems. Polite laughter rippled through the room. The sound of it settled on Elena's shoulders like weight. She took one measured breath. The patient had survived because of her placement. She knew it. Pierce knew it. Everyone in that room with actual clinical experience knew it. But knowledge and power weren't the same thing. Knowledge didn't get you respect in a hierarchy. Pierce had the microphone. Pierce had the institution. Pierce had seniority measured in decades and connections measured in money. He closed the chart. We'll discuss the broader implications during our next M&M conference. Thank you all. The meeting ended. Chairs scraped back. Conversation resumed. Elena remained motionless until everyone filtered out, then she moved toward the door with the gait of someone walking through water, each step deliberate, each movement controlled. Later that afternoon, by the vending machine outside the break room, 2 junior residents leaned against the wall. The machine hummed its electrical drone. One of them saw Elena approaching and nudged the other. Mr. Doctor, the taller resident said in a thick, exaggerated accent that bore no resemblance to Spanish or any actual language, just cruelty shaped like mockery. The patient, he need the help, yes. The second resident laughed. No, Misu's doctor. The patient, she is very sick. I use the old-time needle, very traditional. They didn't stop. Elena approached the machine slowly. She inserted her dollar bill. The mechanical jaw accepted it. She selected black coffee, regular, no sugar. The machine dispensed a paper cup with the sound of something breaking inside the mechanism. 10 feet away, Dr. Pierce stood with arms crossed. He'd positioned himself perfectly, close enough to witness, far enough to claim he hadn't been watching. His smirk was the expression of a man who knew he held all the cards. Elena poured the coffee with steady hands. Steam rose from the cup in thin wisps that smelled like burnt rubber and something darker underneath. She turned to face the residents. Her eyes were dry. She didn't look angry. She looked the way a person looked after they'd already lost everything once and understood that survival was a choice, not a gift. One tear escaped her left eye. Just one. She wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact. Without looking away. My English was good enough in Tikrit, she said quietly. The residents' laughter died. One of them actually took a step back. Pierce's smirk didn't just fade. It transformed into something colder. Something with teeth. Elena walked past them toward the nursing station. She didn't hurry. She didn't slow down. She carried her coffee like a flag. The encounter lasted 90 seconds. The consequences would multiply through the hospital like a virus with her name on it. That afternoon, Elena reviewed patient charts at the nursing station. The fluorescent light above her desk flickered every 7 seconds, a small, repeated interruption in an otherwise steady hum. She was checking Sergeant Major Dawson's son's file when she saw it, a billing code marked as performed the previous day. A specialized procedure. One that required an operating room, equipment, and at least 90 minutes. She'd been on shift. The procedure never happened. Elena approached the billing clerk, a woman named Susan who'd worked at St. Michael's for 16 years. "Susan, can you check this code? I was on shift yesterday. I don't remember this procedure being scheduled or performed." Susan's face went pale. Actually pale, the color draining from her cheeks like someone had turned off a valve. "I'll look into it," she said, and she wouldn't make eye contact. Within an hour, Elena received a message, report to Dr. Pierce's office. Immediately. His office was designed to make visitors feel small. A desk made of dark wood that must have cost more than Elena's car. A leather chair behind it that squeaked when he shifted his weight. 2 guest chairs in front that were intentionally lower, forcing anyone sitting in them to look upward. He didn't invite her to sit. "I've had concerns about your performance," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Multiple staff members have reported communication issues. Competency questions." Elena's jaw tightened. Her hands wanted to make fists, so she kept them flat against her legs. "What specific incidents?" Pierce slid a folder across the desk. It landed with a soft thud. Elena opened it. 3 pages. Handwritten complaints on hospital letterhead. Names she didn't recognize. Dates that didn't match her schedule. Comments about her clinical judgment, her unorthodox methods, her attitude toward supervising physicians. None of this had been addressed to her directly. None of this had been shown to her until this moment. She'd received no opportunity to respond, to clarify, to defend. The file was already written. She was being informed of its existence, not asked to participate in its creation. "We'll be monitoring you closely," Pierce said. He leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked like a sigh. "Any further incidents, and we'll need to involve HR." Elena closed the folder. Her voice came out steady, level, the way you spoke when you were translating between 2 languages and trying not to let the true meaning show in your inflection. "I understand." "Good. You're dismissed." She stood. Turned. Left without another word. That evening, at 6:51 p.m., Pierce made the first phone call. He sat in his office after everyone had left, the hospital corridors empty except for the night shift moving through them like ghosts. He called Richard Bancroft, one of the hospital board members, the kind of man who golfed with the hospital's CEO and whose opinion carried weight in rooms Elena would never enter. "Richard, I wanted to reach out about a developing staffing situation," Pierce said, his voice modulated to convey professional concern. "One of our floor nurses has been displaying some concerning judgment patterns. Several colleagues have documented instances of clinical oversight. I'm not suggesting anything formal yet, but given our liability concerns, I thought you should be aware." The second call came at 7:12 p.m. This one went to Dr. Marcus Chen, who sat on the hospital's credentialing committee. Pierce and Chen had gone to medical school together 30 years ago, and though they hadn't spoken in months, the debt of shared history still held. "Marcus, I need to give you a heads up about something," Pierce said. His tone was careful, regretful, the tone of someone forced to share bad news about a friend. "I've been monitoring a floor nurse, Elena Martinez, and I've got some real competency concerns. I don't want to step out of line, but given her role in patient care, I thought the credentialing committee should flag this for future reference." By the time Elena clocked out at 11 p.m., the first two dominoes had already fallen. She just didn't know it yet. She walked to her locker in the change room, a small space with 4 walls and a door that locked from the outside but could be forced open in under 3 seconds if someone decided your contents mattered more than privacy. She pulled off her scrubs, changed into jeans and a hospital hoodie, grabbed her bag. In the mirror, she looked at her own face. The image was of a woman in her mid-30s with dark hair pulled back, brown eyes that had seen too much for one lifetime, and a jaw that could have been carved from granite. No tear stains. No visible damage. Just the kind of composed exterior that you learn to maintain when your survival depended on not showing weakness to people who would use it against you. She didn't know that the machine of Pierce's institution was already moving, already grinding, already calculating how to remove her from the hospital entirely. She didn't know that his phone calls would be relayed in casual conversations tomorrow, and that those conversations would create a narrative. She didn't know that narratives, once established, became facts in the eyes of people with power. All she knew in that moment was that her hands were steady. That she had stood still under fire before, both literal and institutional. That she had survived worse than a doctor's resentment. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Pierce wasn't finished. He was just beginning. And in the next 72 hours, everything would accelerate into crisis. The ICU fell quiet at 1:11 a.m. Not the peaceful quiet of sleep. The quiet of a system holding its breath. Sergeant Major Thomas Dawson hadn't left his son's bedside in 36 hours. Marcus lay in the hospital bed like a small broken thing, tubes running from his nose, his arm, his chest. The boy's condition was degenerative, the neurologist said. Progressive. They used words like palliative care and comfort measures the way other people used weather talk. Marcus was 8 years old. He couldn't move his legs anymore. He could barely move his arms. But he could still cry. He still called for his father when the pain got bad. Dawson sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed, his marine dress uniform still pressed and sharp from visiting hours, his hands, scarred and weathered from 23 years of active duty, folded across his stomach. He was a man built for action, trained to solve problems with strategy and force. And he was completely helpless. Watching his son's machines. Listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor. Waiting for something he couldn't prevent. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. In. Out. In. Out. Automated breathing for a boy whose own lungs were beginning to fail him. The monitors showed everything: oxygen saturation holding at 94%, heart rate normal, blood pressure stable. Everything looked controlled. Everything looked fine. At 2:03 a.m., everything changed. The oxygen saturation line on the monitor dropped like a stone. 94, 88. 82, falling too fast to be a sensor error. The monitor began its ascending alarm, not urgent yet, just a gentle escalation, beep beep beep, asking for attention. Dawson's eyes snapped to the numbers. 60 years of military training made him read vital signs the way other men read headlines. That drop shouldn't happen. Not that fast. Not on supplemental oxygen and a functioning ventilator. Marcus's small chest heaved. Once. Twice. Then his neck changed. The boy's neck veins distended like cords pulling tight beneath pale skin. His trachea, the windpipe visible at the center of his throat, shifted sideways. Visibly. Millimeter by millimeter, sliding away from midline. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the chest cavity. Collapsed lung. The pressure building, pushing organs aside, choking off blood return to the heart. Dawson knew this pattern. He'd seen it in field medicine briefs. He'd heard the combat medics talk about it in Fallujah. Minutes. That's how long you had. Then cardiac arrest. Something's wrong, Dawson said. His voice was low and controlled but carried the weight of command. Get someone in here. Now. The ICU nurse, a second-year RN named Jennifer who'd been checking vitals every hour, was at the bedside in 3 seconds. She saw the distended veins. She saw the tracheal deviation. She didn't know what it meant, but her training told her it meant crisis. Code Blue, ICU 4. Code Blue, ICU 4. Her voice through the overhead system cut through the hospital's night silence like a siren. They came fast. That was the one thing the hospital did well. When the alarm sounded, people moved. Dr. Pierce came through the door first, still tucking his shirt in. He'd been in the on-call room, followed by 2 residents and the respiratory therapist. The room filled with bodies and purpose. Machines alarming in concert now. O2 sat at 76. Dropping. What do we have? Pierce demanded, his voice all command, all authority. He was already scanning the monitors, already seeing the downward trend. Increase FiO2 to 100%. Get RT to check tube position. Is he on a vent? Yes, sir. Pressure control, 18.5, respiratory rate set to. Check it, Pierce snapped. Tube might be malpositioned. Suction line. Is there secretion? He moved to the bedside, leaning over Marcus with the focused intensity of a man solving a puzzle. The boy's eyes were wide with fear. His small hands clawed at the bedsheet. His lips were taking on a bluish tint. Push another albuterol neb. Let's see if we're dealing with bronchospasm. O2 sat at 71. The heart rate was climbing. 118, 134. The body's frantic response to suffocation. Nothing they were doing was working because they weren't looking at what was actually in front of them. The trachea was still deviated. The neck vein still distended. The clinical picture screaming a single diagnosis that none of them were seeing because they were caught in the machinery of protocol: increase oxygen, check placement, treat for bronchospasm. Standard responses to a non-standard emergency. 48 seconds had passed. Elena was already moving before the overhead announcement finished echoing. She'd been in the medication room, 3 units away, restocking crash cart supplies for the morning shift, hands full of pediatric-sized equipment. She dropped everything. The supplies scattered across the floor. She didn't look back. Her feet knew the way. Muscle memory carried her through the corridors. Night shift at a hospital was different, emptier, stranger, the usual chaos replaced by a kind of suspended waiting. She could hear the code team's footsteps ahead of her. She moved faster. The ICU for room was already crowded when she reached the doorway. Pierce stood at the head of the bed, barking orders. 2 residents flanked him. The respiratory therapist was checking ventilator settings. Jennifer stood with her hand on the crash cart, ready but uncertain. And in the corner, a man in a marine dress uniform with a face like carved stone watched his son turn blue. Elena saw everything in the space of one breath. The distended jugular veins. The trachea shifted to the right. The paradoxical breathing pattern, the chest moving but the oxygen dropping anyway. Classic. Textbook. Attention pneumothorax compressing the lung, collapsing it, pushing everything aside, building pressure in the chest cavity that was slowly strangling his heart. O2 sat at 68. His intention pneumo, Elena said. Her voice was quiet but it carried. It had to carry. Needle decompression. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Right side. Now. Pierce's head snapped toward her like she'd thrown something at him. His eyes registered her presence and something shifted in his expression, a flash of calculation, then a hardening of his jaw. This is a closed ICU. Get out. He'll be in cardiac arrest in 90 seconds. This is a closed ICU, Pierce repeated, louder, his voice an instrument designed to dominate. He turned back to Marcus. We're waiting for the chest tube kit. It's on its way up from the supply room. 2 minutes. 2 minutes. The boy's lips were navy blue now. His breathing rapid and shallow, the dying respiratory pattern, gasping because the signals were screaming that something was wrong but there was nothing to breathe. His small hand reached out, found his father's. Dawson's grip tightened. His other hand was pressed against the wall behind him so hard his knuckles were white. O2 sat at 63. Elena moved to the crash cart. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce what she was doing. Her hands opened the pediatric tray and found what she needed, a 14-gauge angiocath needle, already packaged, sterile, designed for exactly this emergency. She tore the wrapper open. Don't touch that patient, Pierce said. His voice dropped to something lower, something that belonged to a man used to being obeyed. I will have your license. I will have you arrested. Elena looked at the boy. At Sergeant Major Dawson's face, that controlled military composure cracking, his eyes begging, pleading without words. At the folded flag in the corner of her mind, the one from Tikrit, the one from the teammate who didn't make it home. She took one measured breath. Then do it, she said quietly. She moved to the bedside. Her hands found the landmarks, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, right side. The anatomy was smaller but identical. Her fingers felt for the rib, found the space between. She'd done this intense with artillery fire shaking the ground. She'd done this by flashlight with her hands shaking from adrenaline and lack of sleep. This was different. This was a child. This was someone's son. Her hands moved anyway. The needle went in with a small resistance. The hiss of released air was immediate, a sound like pressure escaping a valve, like breath finally coming, like survival. The sound of a pneumothorax decompressing. The rush of air that had been crushing the lung now venting into the atmosphere instead of into the chest. The effect was instantaneous. Marcus gasped. His small chest expanded. The monitors responded in real time. O2 sat at 63. Then 68. Then 74. The numbers climbing. The heart rate slowly descending as the pressure released. The trachea beginning to slide back toward midline. The room went completely silent. Not the silence of a normal conversation ending. The silence of something fundamental shifting. For physicians stood around the bedside of a child they couldn't save, and they'd just watched a nurse do what they couldn't. Pierce's face had gone white, the kind of white that comes right before rage. His hands were clenched at his sides. You just practice medicine without a license, Pierce said. His voice was almost conversational now, which somehow made it worse. In front of 4 witnesses. He was already reaching for his phone. Elena stepped back from the bedside. She placed the needle kit on the crash cart with the precision of someone laying down a weapon. Her hands were completely steady. Her expression hadn't changed. She looked at Sergeant Major Dawson for 1 second, just one, and in that second something passed between them that didn't need words. Then she looked at Pierce. Get the chest tube kit, she said, her voice carrying command despite the white coat she was wearing. His lung needs full re-expansion and the air needs continuous drainage. He's stable for now, but only if you're fast. Pierce's jaw clenched. "I will destroy you." "You can try," Elena said quietly. The chest tube kit arrived 2 minutes later. It took Pierce exactly 11 minutes to place it, 11 minutes during which Elena stood at the bedside, watching the boy's oxygen saturation climb, watching his color improve, watching Sergeant Major Dawson's hand never leave his son's grip. When it was done, when Marcus was stable again, when the crisis had transformed into recovery, Pierce stepped out of the room and pulled out his phone. Elena heard the first call being placed before she'd even left the ICU. She heard the words "practicing medicine without a license" carried down the hallway. She heard him say her name like it was a curse. 36 hours later, a security guard would escort her out of St. Michael's with a cardboard box in her arms. But in this moment, in the ICU at 2:17 a.m., Elena Martinez stood in the hallway outside a room where a child was breathing and an 8-year-old was alive, and Sergeant Major Thomas Dawson was holding his son's hand and still hadn't let go. The boy's eyes snapped open. His chest heaved once, twice, and then, breathing. Real breathing. The color rushed back into his small face like someone had turned a valve. Pale blue melted into pink. His fingers curled around his father's hand with the grip of a child surfacing from drowning. The oxygen saturation numbers climbed on the monitor behind him. 75, 82, 88, 94. Stable. Sergeant Major Dawson's shoulders collapsed inward. His hand, massive and scarred from 23 years of service, trembled as he held his son's palm against his chest. Tears streamed down his face without sound, the kind of crying that has nothing to do with noise and everything to do with the animal relief of watching your child live. His jaw clenched and unclenched. His other hand gripped the side of the hospital bed so hard the metal groaned. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Every single person in that ICU knew exactly what they were witnessing, a father who had almost lost everything, watching it return to him in the space of 6 seconds. Elena stepped back from the bed. Her hands fell to her sides, steady as stone, palms open. There was no tremor in her fingers. No shakiness in her legs. She had performed the procedure the way she performed everything, with the precision of someone who had done this before under conditions infinitely worse than a sterile ICU. Her scrubs were still dry. Her breathing was normal. To anyone looking, she was simply a night nurse who had stepped back from a patient. Nothing more. But Dr. Pierce saw something different. He was standing in the doorway, his tablet still in his hand, and his face had gone the color of old cement. Not angry. Not frustrated. White. The kind of white that comes from watching the ground shift beneath your feet. His mouth was slightly open. His eyes tracked from the boy's climbing oxygen numbers to Elena's steady hands to the monitors that were singing with the evidence of her work. 4 doctors stood frozen around the room. 2 residents. 1 respiratory therapist. All of them had stood paralyzed while the child's oxygen saturation plummeted. All of them had reached for protocols and hesitated. And then Elena had moved. She had moved the way apex predators move, fluid, certain, without the friction of doubt. The 14-gauge angiocath needle had gone into the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and the hiss of air escaping had been the sound of a child getting his life back. Pierce's jaw tightened. He turned and walked back into the hallway. His phone was in his hand before the ICU doors had fully closed behind him. The sergeant major never looked away from his son. He was counting the breaths. Watching the rise and fall. Committing the sight of his child alive to memory the way soldiers commit the faces of their brothers to memory, with the understanding that you never know when you'll need to hold onto something. He finally looked up at Elena, and his eyes held the intensity of someone who had stood on rooftops in places she could not name, watching for movement in the darkness. Someone who understood the cost of seconds. Of reflexes. Of hands that knew what to do when thinking would kill you. "Thank you," he said. Just that. 2 words that carried 8 years of prayers. Elena nodded. She didn't trust her voice. Not yet. The adrenaline was still in her system, still making her pupils dilate, still keeping her hands precisely where they needed to be. She'd seen this before, the aftermath of action, that moment when the body realizes it has survived something impossible. She turned toward the sink, began washing her hands. The soap smelled like copper and antiseptic. Normal things. Hospital things. Behind her, the monitor continued its steady rhythm. The boy was breathing. The sergeant major was holding his hand. The oxygen saturation had climbed to 97. By 9:33 a.m., Dr. Pierce had made his first call. The hospital board chairman, David Vance, received it in his office on the 3rd floor. He was reviewing budget projections when his secretary transferred the call through. Pierce's voice was clipped, professional, carrying the weight of clinical concern. A nurse had overstepped. Had performed a procedure without authorization. Had potentially violated state medical board regulations. The patient outcome had been positive, Pierce acknowledged this, but the liability exposure was significant. Very significant. The board needed to document the incident, initiate an investigation, ensure that protocols had not been compromised. He recommended immediate administrative action. By 10:15 a.m., Vance had called the state nursing board. An investigator named Susan Reeves confirmed that she could schedule a formal interview. They would need to speak with Elena Martinez within the week. Pending the outcome, her license might need to be placed on temporary suspension during the investigation. By 10:43 a.m., Dr. Marcus Webb, Pierce's medical school roommate and a member of the hospital credentialing committee, received an email. It was marked urgent. The email contained incident reports, clinical notes marked with red flags, and a detailed narrative of Elena's actions in the ICU. The subject line read, "Patient safety concern, recommend immediate credentialing review." Webb, who had roomed with Pierce for 4 years at Johns Hopkins and still golfed with him twice a month, opened the attachment. He read about the unauthorized procedure. He read about the pattern of concerning behavior. He forwarded the email to the credentialing chair with a note, "This needs immediate attention." By 2:14 p.m., Elena was called to the administration office. No email. No formal notice. Just a phone call from the HR director asking her to come up to the 4th floor immediately. She went. She rode the elevator past the 3rd floor, past the 2nd, watching the numbers climb. The elevator hummed like it was singing dirges. When the doors opened, the hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that means something has already been decided. The meeting lasted 7 minutes. They presented her with a termination notice. Effective immediately. For violating patient care protocols. For performing a procedure outside her scope of practice. For creating a patient safety risk. Her license had not been suspended, not yet, but the investigation was pending. In the meantime, her employment was terminated. They were very sorry. These were serious matters. Elena signed the papers. She didn't ask questions. She had spent enough time in institutional settings to understand when asking questions was a courtesy and when it was theater. This was theater. The decision had been made before she walked in. She stood, picked up the envelope they slid across the desk, and walked out. Security was waiting in the hallway. 2 guards, neither of them the ones who usually worked ICU detail. They escorted her to the break room where her personal locker was, watched while she emptied it. The cracked coffee mug that had survived 8 years of night shifts. The wilting succulent in its ceramic pot, she had forgotten to water it since Thursday. The photo in a plastic frame, 9 faces in desert camo, all of them smiling at a camera someone had rigged on a tripod outside the Tikrit aid station. 3 of those faces were not smiling anymore. 3 of those faces had stayed in the desert. At the bottom of her locker was the shadow box. She had kept it wrapped in a towel for 2 years, had never opened it in the hospital, had never shown it to anyone. But she took it out now. The folded flag lay inside, triangular and heavy, the weight of someone's life compressed into fabric and ritual. Her teammate. Her friend. The one who had told her, on the last night they were together, that he wanted to go home and learn to fish. She placed the flag carefully in a cardboard box she'd been given. The box was barely holding together, already starting to warp from the humidity in the break room. She packed everything carefully, the way you pack things you're trying not to break. Security walked her through the main lobby at 2:02 p.m. Staff members turned away. Dr. Reyes, the cardiologist who had brought her coffee that morning, watched from the second-floor landing, his face stricken. Pierce stood near the main entrance, arms crossed, watching her escorted out like a thief caught with merchandise. His expression was calm. Satisfied. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. She just held the box and walked straight ahead, the way soldiers walk when cameras are rolling. The rain started at 3 p.m. By 6 p.m., it was coming down like artillery. Elena sat at a bus stop 3 blocks from St. Michael's, the cardboard box on her lap getting progressively wetter. The succulent had tipped over inside. The photo frame was fogging up. The flag's shadow box was still dry. She'd positioned the box to protect it, but everything else was soaked and ruined and falling apart the way things do when you put them in cardboard and then expose them to weather. She stared at nothing. The parking lot across the street. The traffic light that had just turned green. The rain streaming down the plexiglass shelter like the shelter was crying. Her mascara had run. She'd wiped it twice with the back of her hand, but more had leaked down since then. She wasn't sobbing. She wasn't even making noise. But her left hand was trembling, worse than usual, the tremor that had never quite gone away from the shrapnel in her wrist, and she was holding the box so tight her fingers were leaving marks in the cardboard. A truck pulled up to the curb. Not a bus. A truck. An old Ford, the kind that had seen actual work, with military plates and a small bronze star flag on the antenna. The engine shut off. The door opened. Sergeant Major Dawson stepped out into the rain. He was still in his dress uniform, the one he'd been wearing when he first brought Marcus to the ER 4 nights ago. The rain plastered his hair down, soaked his shoulders. He didn't seem to notice. He walked across the sidewalk and sat down on the bench beside Elena without asking. The bench was wet. He was already soaked. He sat there for a long moment without speaking, just breathing, just existing in the space beside her. Finally, he said, "They fired you. For saving my son." Elena nodded. She didn't trust her voice. Why would they do that? She still didn't answer. Because the answer was complicated and institutional and had nothing to do with what happened and everything to do with power and hierarchy and what happens when you prove that the people in charge are not actually in charge. Dawson looked at the photo visible in the box, the unit in desert camo, 9 faces in the sun. "Where do you serve?" His voice was quiet. Clinical. The way someone asks when they already know the answer. Tikrit. Field hospital. But that was, Elena stopped. Her throat closed. She couldn't explain what came next, couldn't find words for it. That was someone else. Dawson's eyes narrowed. Not angry. Interested. Someone else? I can't. I'm not supposed to. The words came out broken. She held the box tighter. Everything about that time is classified. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and took the box from her hands. It was such a gentle movement, just opening his hands and letting her place the box in them like an offering. He carried it to his truck, opened the passenger door. "You're not sitting in the rain," he said. Elena Saturday. The bench was cold. The rain fell. And somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed toward St. Michael's, carrying someone else's emergency, someone else's life compressed into the seconds between diagnosis and intervention. 3 days later, the Iraqi translator stood in the hallway outside pre-op, waiting for her surgical team to wheel her toward the OR. The afternoon light cut through the windows in sharp geometric lines. She was thin, dark eyes clouded with pre-medication, but when Elena passed, just passing, moving between rooms with a chart, those eyes went wide. The translator's breath caught. Her hand rose, trembling, and she whispered something. Not English. Arabic. Al-Malik al-Azraq. The Blue Angel. Then louder, voice cracking, Captain. Captain Martinez. You saved my sister in Tikrit. You saved, her voice broke into Farsi, then back to English, gasping, 17. You saved 17 of us. Sergeant Major Dawson heard it from 3 rooms away. His footsteps came fast, not running, but the kind of controlled urgency that comes from a man who has moved toward gunfire. He stopped at the translator's stretcher. Looked at Elena. Something shifted in his eyes, like a locked door swinging open to a room he'd been searching for. He made 2 phone calls from the hospital parking lot. One to someone at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. Another to someone whose voice on the other end made Dawson stand straighter, even sitting in his truck. 40 minutes later, he walked back into St. Michael's lobby carrying a leather folder, aged the color of old maps. He waited until Elena finished her rounds. Found her by the coffee station on the 3rd floor, and wrapped around a cup that had gone cold. Come with me, Dawson said. Not a request. It was the tone of a man whose words had never been questioned. Elena followed. The hospital lobby was crowded, afternoon shift change, visitors, the organized chaos of a level 1 trauma center. Dawson stood in the center of it, folder open, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. He read from the citation in a cadence that turned heads, that made people stop walking. Captain Elena Martinez. Favela under fire while performing emergency field amputations under direct enemy contact in Tikrit, Iraq, saving 17 lives when Forward Aid Station Jolan was overrun. For extraordinary courage in the face of sustained hostile fire. For refusing to abandon wounded Marines when extraction was ordered. For operating under conditions no person should endure. For, his voice thickened. For being the reason my son is alive today. The lobby had gone quiet. The kind of quiet where you could hear the ventilation system breathing through the vents overhead. That's when the elevator doors burst open. Dr. Pierce emerged, white coat flaring, face flushed the color of old brick. He moved toward Dawson with the fury of a man watching everything collapse. That's fraud, Pierce shouted, loud enough that security heads turned. That's impersonation. That's a nurse practicing medicine without a license and lying about military service. I have documentation. I have witnesses. I filed complaints with the state board, the medical board, his voice climbed, cracking at the edges. She's not a captain. She's a nurse. Dawson didn't look at Pierce. Didn't stop reading. His voice dropped lower, colder, the voice of someone reading last rites. The folder trembled in his hands, but his words didn't. Every name. Every unit designation. Every detail that would take a man with access to classified records to know. Pierce opened his mouth. Closed it. His eyes darted between the folder, Elena's face, and the crowd of hospital staff now frozen in place, phones already emerging from pockets. The lobby doors opened again. This time, the air pressure changed. The 2-star general didn't walk so much as materialize, dress blue uniform crisp enough to cut glass, medals arranged in ascending order across his chest like a timeline of violence and honor. Behind him, a Pentagon liaison in a charcoal suit. The general's eyes found Elena in less than 2 seconds. He crossed the lobby in 12 strides. When he reached her, he didn't speak. He saluted, a sharp, precise movement that would have looked staged if it wasn't so absolutely real. His hand rose to his temple and held, while the lobby watched. When his hand dropped, everyone in that space felt the weight of something shift. Something official. Something that couldn't be unclaimed. Captain Martinez, the general said, his voice like gravel over steel. Your service is acknowledged. He turned to Dawson. Sergeant Major, your son's recovery is a testament to her training and her character. The Department of Defense is prepared to make a full statement regarding Captain Martinez's status, her deployment record, and her current standing with the military. Pierce had moved backward, step by step, his mouth working around words that wouldn't come. A nurse, Elena recognized her as Jennifer from the ER, was filming everything on her phone. Her hands were steady. The liaison stepped forward with a sealed envelope. Official letterhead. Pentagon seal. She placed it in Elena's hands. Your records have been declassified to the extent operationally feasible, the liaison said, voice clipped and professional. Black Ops extraction, deep cover, identity protection protocols. Your paperwork was intentionally scrubbed to protect ongoing intelligence operations. You were ordered into that cover. Those orders came from above my clearance level. That cover is now officially lifted. The lobby had filled with sound, phones ringing, people calling others, the electricity of something moving faster than the hospital's systems could absorb. Someone had already uploaded the video. By evening, it would have 500,000 views. Dr. Fire's war hero nurse. The comment section exploded like a breached dam. 3,000 people tagged the hospital's official account. News outlets began requesting statements by 6 p.m. At 6:08 p.m., Dr. Alan Kessler, legendary surgeon, former chief of trauma at Johns Hopkins, the man who had trained Pierce 20 years ago, made a phone call to the hospital board chairman. His voice was quiet. What he said would echo longer than any shout. If that man represents my teaching, Kessler said, I have failed. Remove my name from anything connected to him. Immediately. The board chairman called Pierce into an emergency meeting at 8 a.m. the next morning. Pierce arrived confident, his documentation folder thick, his witness list prepared. He'd saved everything. He had protocol violations in writing. He had the Grand Rounds incident recorded from his perspective. He had her false medical intervention documented by 4 physicians. He had? The chairman didn't let him finish. The video has 3 million views, the chairman said. The Pentagon has provided authentication of her rank and service status. Dr. Kessler has requested his name be removed from your biography. The State Medical Board is investigating your billing practices. He slid a printed email across the table. 17 procedures coded and never performed. Including procedures billed for the Dawson child. Pierce's face drained the way faces do when they understand they're not in control of the room anymore. When they understand the room is no longer their room. You're suspended pending investigation, the chairman said. Security will escort you from the building. Pierce walked out through the same lobby where Elena had been escorted out. This time, nobody looked away. Dr. Reyes stood by the information desk, arms crossed. A group of nurses turned their backs in unison as he passed. The gesture was choreographed by nothing but collective understanding. One of the surgical techs, someone who'd worked with him for 3 years, removed his hospital ID from the wall, the way you'd take down a photo of someone who'd hurt you. His research grants dried up within 7 days. The University of North Carolina issued a statement distancing itself from his work. 3 conferences withdrew his speaking invitations. His wife left on day 9, taking the car and the house down payment money. By month 3, his license was suspended. By month 6, he was driving a medical supply van for a regional distributor, loading boxes of catheters and oxygen tubing, sleeping in a rented room that smelled like other people's lives. 6 months later, Elena stood at the ICU window, watching Sergeant Major Dawson's son breathe easy in a recovery room. The boy was laughing, actually laughing, with his father, color in his cheeks, lungs working the way 8-year-old lungs should work. Elena wore dark slacks now, not scrubs. A clinical nurse specialist badge. The hospital had promoted her, reinstated her with back pay, and created an entire new division, Combat Trauma Nursing Protocol. They'd printed her commendation on the wall outside the trauma bay. 17 lives saved. The exact number. The folded flag sat on the windowsill beside her coffee mug, catching the morning light the way flags do when they mean something beyond fabric. Dawson joined her at the window. His hand rested on her shoulder for a moment. Saw the news about Pierce, Dawson said quietly. Medical supply company hired him. Drives the delivery route. He pulled out his phone, showed her the photo from a local business article. Pierce in a polo shirt instead of a white coat, unloading boxes, shoulders curved inward the way shoulders curve when they've learned to take up less space. Elena looked at the photo for 3 seconds. Handed the phone back. "I feel tired," she said. "But I feel useful." A movement caught her eye below. A medical supply van pulled up to the loading dock. Pierce got out, checked his clipboard, started moving boxes. He glanced up at the hospital windows, maybe seeing her, maybe not. His face was the color of November. Dr. Reyes approached from behind with a tablet. "Captain Martinez, the new trauma protocol presentation. The board's ready for you." Elena picked up the folded flag, held it for a moment. The weight of it was the weight of 17 names. Of Tikrit. Of the ones who made it and the ones who didn't. "Ready," Elena said. As she walked toward the conference room, Dawson called after her. "Captain!" She turned. He snapped a salute, sharp, formal, the kind of salute that means something. Other people in the hallway saw it. A Navy corpsman in scrubs, 2 Marine veterans visiting a family member, an older nurse who'd been there in the ER when Elena saved Marcus. They stood. They saluted. Elena's eyes caught light. She saluted back, her hand rising to her temple, holding steady. In her office, she added a new photo to her desk, Dawson's son holding a toy Marine helicopter, grinning like he'd never stopped breathing easy. Beside it, her Bronze Star certificate, finally out of hiding where it had waited in a sealed envelope for 3 years. The intercom crackled. "Captain Martinez to the ER. Multi-vehicle accident. Multiple traumas." She set the flag down gently on the desk, ran her fingers over the fabric one more time, and whispered the names, all 17 of them, plus the one who'd given her the flag. Then she tied her hair back, checked her hands. They didn't shake anymore. They moved with the certainty of someone who had already survived the worst and chosen to come back. Chose to keep coming back. Subscribe for more stories about the people who carry quiet strength. The ones who've seen the worst and still show up. The ones who save lives when the world stops watching. Like, comment, and let me know, what would you have done in Elena's position? Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to break.